Representative Fine, you're recognized to explain your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems as Mickey and many have joined us in the chamber today. That said, this is the bill that we discussed yesterday.
Members, we will either go into structured debate or we will call the previous question. Representative Renner, you're recognized for a motion.
Here, Mr. Speaker, I move the previous question on the bill.
Representative Renner moves the previous question on the bill. This motion is not debatable and requires a majority vote. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Show the motion passes. We will now proceed to call the previous question. The clerk will unlock the machine and members will proceed to vote on Senate Bill 4C. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? Clerk will lock the machine. Announce the vote.
70 yeas, 38 nays, Mr.
Show the bill
Speaker.
passes. Read the next bill.
By Senator Bradley, Senate Bill 6C, a bill to be entitled and act relating to social media platforms.
Representative Andrade, you're recognized to explain your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the bill repealing the carve-out that every Democrat voted to oppose last year.
Members, we will either proceed to debate or we will entertain a motion to call the previous question. Representative Renner, you're recognized for a motion.
Mr. Speaker, I move the previous question on the bill.
Representative Renner moves the previous question on the bill. This motion is not debatable. Members, we are now going to proceed to the next two bills. These two bills have got a lot of questions and a lot of attention over the last couple of days. Every member in this chamber should have the opportunity to debate them, to talk about them, and to speak their piece. We are going to move on to those two bills. If we can have a civil debate that respects the rules of this House that all of us have voted and agreed to, then we will do that. If, however, our colleagues continue to try to shut down our process, I will entertain a motion to call the previous question, and we will vote on these two bills. It is my hope that we will be able to proceed civilly and with decorum and with respect for one another. Read the next bill.
By Senator Bradley, Senate Bill 4C, a bill to be entitled and act relating to independent special districts.
I'd also like to make another announcement before we get into the subject of today's program. I think, as many of you know, the Florida legislature is meeting this week to consider the congressional reapportionment plan for Florida for the next 10 years, and that is what they've been called upon to do. But I am announcing today that we are expanding the call of what they are going to be considering this week. And so, yes, they will be considering the congressional map, but they also will be considering termination of all special districts that were enacted in Florida prior to 1968, and that includes the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And I want to thank Speaker Sprowls and Senator Simpson for not only working, obviously, for the reapportionment, but for stepping up and making sure that we make the sunset or the termination on those special districts happen, which I think is very important.
Coming from South Carolina, we've got voter ID, and I'm assuming Texas is the same way. Do y'all need IDs to buy alcohol when you're purchasing at the store?
Yes, to be sure that you are capable of doing that.
Right. Do you need an ID in Texas to buy cigarettes?
You can't buy them unless you're at least 21.
But do you have to show an ID to buy cigarettes?
You have to show an ID.
Do you need an ID when you're getting a job and trying to get on payroll in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID to go to the pharmacy and get a prescription in Texas?
It depends on the prescription.
But do you need an ID for some prescriptions in
Yes, you
Texas?
do. Yes.
Do you need an ID to get Social Security services in Texas?
You do.
Do you need an ID to rent an apartment in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID if you're going to buy a house and finance it via a mortgage in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID in Texas if you're going to board an aircraft and fly commercial?
Yes.
Did you fly commercial or fly a private jet on the way to D.C.?
A chartered plane.
Do you have to show an ID when you fly in a private charter jet?
Yes.
I wouldn't know. I've never flown on one. So, did you need an ID to get in the building here today?
Yes.
Do you need an ID in Texas to open a bank account?
Yes.
To cash your check if you're working. Do you know, Representative Thompson, what percentage of blacks in Texas, black and brown African Americans, are registered to vote?
Oh, a huge percentage.
70%. Do you know what percentage of African Americans, black and brown Texans, have voted on average or in the last election?
About 64%.
Correct. Do you know how many whites are registered to vote in Texas?
Far more than African Americans.
72%. You have 70% of blacks in Texas who are registered to vote. You have 72% of whites in Texas who are registered to vote. Do you know the percentage of whites who turned out to vote in recent elections?
I want to say over 50-some percent.
65%. Yeah. Do you know what percentage of Hispanics are registered to vote in Texas?
No, I do not.
63%. Do you know what percentage of Hispanics voted in the last election?
I think it was over 40%.
53%. Hispanics are not voting in as high numbers as blacks and whites in Texas. Do you know the percentage of Democrats that support voter ID?
Would you repeat your question?
Do you know the number or percentage of Democrats who support voter ID in this country?
I do not, but I don't think it's a whole lot.
72%. Do you know the number of black and brown and African Americans in this country who support voter ID?
No.
75%. Do you know the number of Hispanics that support voter ID in this country?
No.
81%. Do you know where the state of Texas is ranked with black voter turnout in this country?
Would black voters turn out?
Mm-hmm. Do you know where Texas is ranked?
Oh, about 44%.
The latest numbers that I read this morning was that Texas is ranked 10th. Do you know where Texas is ranked? So then top 10 in the country. Do you know where Texas is ranked with women voters?
Oh, way up in the 50s.
In the bottom third of this country. So I would argue that Texas has a more difficult problem with getting women out to vote than black and brown and African Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
I know my colleague who just spoke is new to the committee, and his comments about distractions certainly remind me of moments that we endured in 2017. We had legislation before the committee, good legislation, bipartisan legislation, to stop the Larry Nassars of the world, to not allow them to move from one job to another and harm people. And we debated that bill for like 3 hours. And you might ask, well, what was the substantive dispute? It was that the Democrats were like, you know what, Larry Nassar was a real bad guy, and we should protect Olympians. And you know who attends the Olympics? Russia. And then they spent hours and hours pursuing the Russia hoax. Now, I look forward to improving and supporting this underlying legislation, and we will have amendments to ripen some issues that I think can really help our American workforce. But we must address a searing matter before the Judiciary Committee and before the country. To label parents domestic terrorists for showing up at school board meetings and caring about their kids is abhorrent, unpatriotic, and un-American. But to lie about doing so is even worse. And somebody knew. As the Attorney General was testifying before this committee saying he couldn't imagine ever appending a label to a parent of domestic terrorism, someone was watching at the FBI and they understood that that was dishonest, that did not paint a clear picture of what was actually happening, because there were threat labels that were being put on folks who loved their kids and who showed up. So here's my question. How many Americans right now that went to a school board meeting, that emailed a parent, that confronted a principal, that reached out to their school board members, that ran into a superintendent at the supermarket and expressed their view? How many of those Americans right now are carrying a threat label with them? What's next? Can't fly on airplanes? Can't access the U.S. financial system? Get doxxed at their job? Get deplatformed online? The Department of Justice has been politicized, weaponized, and turned against our fellow Americans. But when the Attorney General came and visited us, it was an interesting moment on the calendar because we were days away from an election in Virginia and New Jersey. And maybe the Attorney General believed that because that election was around the corner, he could downplay the aggressive, unpatriotic action that he had taken against America's parents by telling us something different. You know, when Americans lie to the Department of Justice, they get prosecuted, especially when they're conservatives. But when the Attorney General seemingly lies before our committee, the majority doesn't even have follow-up questions. And by the way, this is the same Democratic majority that indicted Steve Bannon because he wouldn't show up while attempting to resolve whether or not there was an executive privilege issue. But then when people actually show up and mislead and are dishonest, there is far less contempt displayed in the face of that dishonesty. My fellow Americans, if the Department of Justice will send the Attorney General here to lie to us, to mislead us, then they will lie to you. I was at dinner recently in Florida with my wife, and a clean-cut dude in his 30s comes up, taps me on the shoulder, and said he was a member of federal law enforcement. And I asked what entity, and he said that he wouldn't tell me, but it was the one I criticized the most. And he said, Mr. Gates, you need to understand that the same divisions that exist in our society today also exist in the FBI. And we're not all up for these terrible things that we see in our organization. And he said, tell Mr. Jordan, thank you for the great work we do, and to know that there are great patriots out there that are working hard to protect our fellow Americans. I'm glad there was a real whistleblower that stood up to tell us what was really going on, because otherwise we wouldn't know. Well, I wonder who that is.
You know, just keep talking. They're not really turning you off. Yeah. It is a little bit like a Twitter moment, though, isn't it? Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the gentleman have an additional 1 minute under the circumstances.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield my remaining 30 seconds.
Gentlemen will suspend. We don't have a clock yet.
Oh, my.
That's a reason to keep going.
Is that foreign interference?
Go ahead, man. My time didn't run out. There's no clock.
And then we have the lights.
Among the unprecedented events of this Congress.
Have you ever seen that? I've never seen that.
Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Gates have a redo, second act?
You had me at hello, Mr. Cohen. If we don't get the Attorney General back, maybe you can bring the chicken.
I want to remind all members that masks must be worn unless you're recognized to speak.
Does that only count if the counter's on and the lights are on?
No.
Well done.
Let's be in, no.
Is this the intermittent power we've been promised in natural resources?
I understand this is a building-wide issue. The committee will stand in recess.